see if this thing will connect with me and move with my face. Hello, friends. Trying to connect to my selfie stick. Apparently it's not going to work today. What is going on? Hi, Fiona. Just me again. Dangerous man. Okay. Trying to figure out. It's good enough, I suppose. Okay. Today we are reading from When the World Didn't End by Guinevere Turner, as I am preparing to talk about this with my cult book club this week. Okay, so she's left the cult and she has moved. So she's left the cult. She grew up in this small cult called the Lyman family. And then she's moved to home with her parents and her mom and her stepfather, who is a horrible, horrible man. And it's just this really good depiction of how a lot of times the cult itself wasn't the exact problem. The cult was just allowing, like the cults are horrible, of course, but it's allowing the adults the permission to neglect and or abuse the children. And a lot of times we see that those adults were going to do that anyways. A week later, I started school at Dover High. She's left her parents and she's gone to live with her grandmother. She's 15. When I arrived at the office with Granny, she said, "Oh my, this school has changed a lot since your mother went here," and then promptly drove home. I was introduced to a woman named Linda. She was wearing a purple suit that strained at her breasts, something I had become newly self-conscious about when my own clothes did it. Her voice was comforting and whelming, but she studied me with something I'd never seen before. She looked worried about me. I thought I'd finally figured out how to blend in, but her eyes told me differently. I could tell I stood out again. Damn it. She invited me to sit with her and her students at lunch. She was the beloved ESL teacher, and I discovered that a large part of the student body was new to the country and learning English for the first time. This is fascinating because I also got put in ESL when I showed up named Daniella with no records from Mexico. When a boy named Fernando offered me a ride home and I asked him why they called the town Doverico, he said there was a giant billboard at the San Juan airport that encouraged people to come to beautiful Dover, Doverico, New Jersey. And that's why a lot of Puerto Ricans lived here. I took this to be true, though I didn't understand why this small town in New Jersey would be a desirable destination for someone from another country. He made sure to let me know he was from Venezuela. I was called the Princess from New York and La Blanca. And one day a girl walked me home and said, "I don't care what anyone says. I like your shoes." All that assimilation for nothing. When we leave our cults, we're just trying so hard to pass, to just pass. We don't know what we're trying to pass as, but we're trying hard to pass. New playing field. But Granny and Dennis both worked, and I could do whatever I wanted after school. I made friends, I dated boys. I called Claire and Brian almost daily, talking on the phone for as long as I wanted. I joked around with Uncle Dennis, made clothes for myself with Granny's expert help. And when I woke up in the morning, I felt so excited for life that I could barely control my joy. I worried about Anna Lee and baby Benjamin, but I couldn't allow myself to think about that too much. FP or Mom would call every other night, planning to visit or saying they would come get me and bring me to New York for the weekend. They'd somehow reframed the whole thing in a way that made me being at Granny's something they'd decided I had to do, but we were all sad about. At first, I'd asked Granny to say I was in the shower when she called, but she laid down the law pretty quickly, saying, "I'm not getting in the middle of any of this. If you don't want to talk to them, tell them yourself." Which, by the way, she's already gone over the shower control that her stepfather puts onto them. Shower control is always a part of controller cults. At least it always gets there. And if you're thinking about the military, yes. When the phone rang, she'd answer and then hold the receiver out to me with her version of a stern expression, which was wide open eyes and raised eyebrows. She was never mean or disciplinarian toward me, just grumpy. It wasn't easy to get her to say more than stuff required to get through a day. But a few times we had long, lovely talks about her past, and I started to really admire her. She loved a tiny glass of sherry when she got home from work, accompanied by a sesame seed covered breadstick. And when she'd settled into her chair to enjoy these things, I would sit across from her on the couch and encourage her to talk. Can't really see the comments so well. Oops, I guess I could have paused the actual recording. While she was talking, I would try to envision the awkward young woman I'd seen in the photos that she had, her smile only present in the pictures taken before she got married. I also saw that she'd been a little overweight and forgave her for warning my mother against having a fat teenager on her hand. Cults always want you skinny. She'd probably been speaking from some past painful experience. I was in the business of starving myself at the time and lusted after the breadstick she was taking tiny bites of as she talked. It was only 40 calories, but still, there was no way I could afford to eat one of those every day. We often leave cults with very messed up body images and very messed up relations to food, because usually the food is part of the power and control that is exercised against us as well. I was beginning to understand that the life she was living had most definitely not been her dream. She had been a Marine in World War II and a spinster at 30, eventually marrying the only taker at the insistence of her parents. I learned that my grandfather was a divorced man when she met him, but I was getting the feeling that he had not been a good man, and she wasn't sad when he died. She spoke wistfully of her daughter Nell, but never about where Nell was now. And she did not speak of my mother's failures because there I was, Exhibit A, a teenage girl living in her house. Mom visited, FP visited, and I somehow avoided going back to that dreaded house in Garrison for most of the school year. I wrote letters to Claire, pined after baby Benjamin and how he was growing up without me, and didn't let on to FP and my mother that I was having a lot of fun at Dover High. There was a cosmetology school inside my new high school, and I was asked to be a model for their annual hair show. I never shared with them how magical it was when I sauntered across the auditorium stage in shiny maroon satin while Shannon's Let the Music Play blasted over the sound system. It seemed crucial to paint my life here as drab, as if it were some kind of punishment. I dreaded FP's visits. He'd arrive by 10 a.m., wandering around Granny's like he owned the place, criticizing the clutter, waltzing into my bedroom, and touching things. Just touching things, like he always did. I'd started to see him not as a calculated creature, but an instinctive one. He wasn't smart enough to devise an evil scheme. He was just delusional and driven enough to make things go his way, and violent enough. He didn't know that his touching things in my room would make my skin crawl. He touched them like an animal would pee on things. I wasn't nearly as scared of him as I used to be, but there was still no relaxing in his presence. Of course, he was heavily sexually abusing her when she lived at her home. When he visited, Granny would be polite and offer him coffee, but then disappear into her bedroom. Dennis stayed in the basement. FP would take me to a nearby diner and, in between complaining about how expensive the food was or being rude to the waitress, say things like, "Your mother has been crying and going through a lot of stuff, and I'm really surprised because I didn't think she cared about you that much." Or, "The shine has left your eyes." Those words make me want to cry, but I did not. Instead, I'd count the minutes until he drove away, so relieved there was no way for us to be alone. I'm not a Prince fan, but I do know why you asked that. When he was gone, I would erase him from my mind for a few days at a time, a luxury. But Brian was going to be home from college for a big football game, and I had to go back for that. While I didn't care about football in the slightest, I wanted to see all my friends, especially him. He'd been calling and writing. We definitely weren't dating, but I indulged myself in a little fantasizing about being his girlfriend. I thought I might be in love with Brian. He was muscular but shy, popular without knowing it, said little, laughed often, and had a sly way about him that telegraphed that he did not care what people thought of him. He'd been the star quarterback of the football team in his senior year of high school, but he was dismissive of the status it brought him. Unlike his teammates, he had longish, feathered hair, and his favorite shirt was from a Foghat concert he'd been to. His biggest passions were playing drums and his band, Talon. He'd written me letters almost every other day since I'd been away. Letters full of jokes and observations about the people we knew, ruminations on life, and every once in a while, a crumb of romance, but not directly stated. FP wouldn't hear of me spending the weekend with Claire while I was in Garrison, and I needed him or my mother for the ride back and forth. So, as much as I didn't want to, I stayed in that house for 2 days. I did get to go to the game and see all my friends and goof around with Brian in the bleachers. But of course, I had to come back when the game was over and not be a part of any of the fun stuff that people were doing afterward. Oh, the control. And then she writes a very long letter to Claire that we're just going to skip over for now. After that, I vowed never to be foolish enough to set foot in that house again. But FP kept coming to see me every weekend, staying later and later, and sometimes just driving aimlessly around in his car in a way that made me scared he was going to kidnap me. He'd find lookout spots, like the spot kind in the movies where teenagers go to make out, and then park and talk my ear off until the windows were completely fogged up and I wanted to scream. He would sometimes put his hand on my knee or find an excuse to touch me. And if he did, I would jump out of the car and tell him I needed to go home, saying either that Granny would be worried or that I had to do homework before bed. He would grumble about it and talk some more, but do as I asked. I had a little more power now, but not much. Toward the end of the school year, he dropped the bomb on me. My mother was pregnant again, and the baby was due in August. She was going to need me to help out after I was done with the school year. There was nothing I could say to get out of this. School would be over, and I would just be a selfish, lazy person if I refused to help out. In my final weeks at Dover High, I was so depressed I could barely get out of bed. It was hard to admit to myself that I was actually going back there. And though we all agreed I'd return to Dover for my last 2 years of high school, I knew that would be something I'd had to fight for when the time came. As I carried my suitcase up the driveway in late June, a wave of nausea came over me, and I vomited in the bushes. No one noticed. So that chapter, I still have to go back and read her letter, which is just about FP. And it's horrible. He's horrible. Okay, showing the painting. It's not a painting. It is an enhanced photograph. And there's actually a TED Talk about it called Beautiful Things That Are Gone by Jason Matthias. And you can look that up. Anyways, this is an ice cave out in Washington State. If you take a picture of that, you can zoom all the way into those trees. It's so crazy. And it's an enhanced photograph. So he took it and then enhanced it on the computer. And yes, Guinevere Turner, 15. And I knocked everything over. I am having a fabulous day. So it's probably too warm for this jacket. But that's okay. I'm going to keep it on while we read from Daniella's book. I am recording all of the chapters of my book, like one part of a chapter at a time. And then eventually I'm going to put them, well, they're going on my Patreon right now for subscribers and on TikTok for subscribers. And then eventually I'm going to make it all into a video of me reading the book, just like I did with Un-American, which is also available on my Patreon. You can buy it for $20 or you can subscribe to Patreon or TikTok and get it for free. Also in my link, we have 3 special book clubs going on at the end of June that will be to discuss Un-American. And Un-American is a second book that I wrote but didn't publish after I had already sold Uncultured. And Uncultured is the story of me growing up in the Children of God religious sex cult and then going into the U.S. Army cult, looking at everything through the lens of group behavior. And then Un-American was when I am asked to testify against an ex-husband that I had married in my college years briefly to be kicked out of the military for white supremacy. And I said to myself, oh no, I'm going to have to write the stories of my life over again, this time looking at it through the lens of power, privilege, whiteness, otherness, and what it means to be un-American / un-American. And I hope that one day I will publish it as a book. I hope I will sell it as a 2-book deal with Un-American and Culting of America. But we shall see, we shall see. Anyways, for now, you can go experience it in those ways. And now we are doing Uncultured. Today for Devotions with Daniella, we are reading. Nope, I'm not going to do it like that because I'm putting it all together. Anyways, this chapter is published in Rolling Stone magazine, and you can read it for yourself. It's all about the programming of the children. We have just been woken up in the middle of the night and told that there was this big raid at one of our communes in Argentina. And we all have to be prepared for the persecution. Despite the fact that we practiced persecution drills all the time, were constantly quizzed on what we'd say to suspicious systemites, it never felt routine. The leaders always managed to add a new detail or twist to keep our fear fresh. They picked apart every mistake we made, perfected our word choice, and coached us on our behavior. They needed us to defend their reputation. There was no doubt we, the youngest of children, were responsible for what happened to the whole family. Our actions could save or damn us all. We were taught to smile and say we were happy. Nobody ever hit us. Nobody ever touched us. We could see our parents whenever we wanted. The adults loved us and wanted what was best for us. Even when we knew we were lying, we were taught it was what God wanted. We had a whole doctrine called deceivers yet true. We dedicated hours of schooling each day to practice what we would say when the dreaded persecution inevitably arrived. Has anyone ever hit you? No, of course not. The children of God is my true family. Everybody loves me and would never hurt me. Has anyone ever touched you sexually? Of course not. We have a very strict policy that prohibits adults from any sexual contact with minors. Deceivers Yet True had been distributed throughout the world for every family child to read, memorize, and repeat. It was a fun read, illustrated by Uncle Zephaniah, Uncle Jerry, and others, and helped show, especially to us younger children, the duality of living under a system in which lying could get us into the worst of trouble, but was also a technique necessary against police and evil authority figures. I loved the dramatized Bible stories and tales of famous Christians who had to lie to continue God's work. Every narrative centered our superheroes evading the bad guys. There was Rahab, the prostitute in Jericho, who hid 2 Israelites and lied to authorities to help them escape. That was an example of lying for God, and also of good prostitutes, like in the old days when my friends' moms had done flirty fishing, going out to sleep with the systemite men to bring money and disciples to the family. That practice ended before I was born, but it had brought a lot of good men to the cause. Then there was Brother Andrew, a Bible smuggler who brought the word of God behind the Iron Curtain, misleading border guards to evade arrest and execution as he spread the gospel through the godless Soviet Union. And I still can never go through like a security checkpoint without being like, I'll see the drug dog and I'll be like, do I have cocaine on me? Even though I've never done cocaine in my life. But we were taught to be very, very afraid of police and authority figures, which is an interesting thing because I feel like I was cultured both ways on police. I was taught as a child very much like Black children are taught in America. And then I came to America and was taught through my whiteness that police are usually very nice to me. Anyways, I wrestle with all of that, the police thing, especially in America. I especially loved the story of the prophet Samuel, who deceived King Saul to anoint David as king. God himself was the one who showed Samuel how to lie by pretending to sacrifice a heifer. On and on it went, with example after example of good guys lying to bad guys. We understood that, under persecution, anything was justified if it got us home again. Lying to the good guys was forbidden, but lying to the bad guys was our sacred right and responsibility. If heroes and even God could lie, we could too. It was us versus them. I also understood that Brazil and Argentina were neighbors. We'd visited that exact commune earlier in the year during one of our biannual faith trips, where we'd leave the country and re-enter at a different place to maintain our tourist visas. which Auntie Dora reminded us was another example of how the children of God needed to lie to evil systemites to do God's will. I tried to remember the faces of the kids I had met at that commune. I wondered if they were scared, if they were remembering how to lie right. I pictured the little girls with whom I played, like 11-year-old Abigail with her long, straight black hair, beautiful dark eyes behind donated glasses, a lot like mine, and her nondescript flowery dress from the donation pile. In my mind, I saw her huddled together with other kids, afraid, enduring hour after hour of questioning. Oh, TikTok wants me to know I'm saying bad words and people are reporting me. Thanks, guys. By the way, what makes someone join a cult is cult members that recruit them. It's the number one reason. The two things that make people vulnerable to joining cults are being a seeker and having a lack of social connections. But we spend so much time talking about why people join cults and looking at the reasons why people join cults. And we never look at there's an entire system designed to recruit them and deceive them. That's why people join cults. What would I do when I was tried and tested, like my heroes in Deceivers Yet True? How would I act when the enemy was at our gates? Could I be a good girl who would defend our life for Jesus? I hoped so. But then I imagined the kids doing worldly things like eating ice cream, drinking Coca-Cola, and watching television. We'd been warned the systemite authorities might use those tactics to bribe us into talking. My stomach growled. Maybe I wanted to be bribed too. I was supposed to be scared of being captured, of being stolen away, but the fear intertwined with a secret yearning I could never name out loud. I wanted to experience the freedom of the outside world. I wanted to be brave and good, but I also wanted to be far away from Uncle Jerry and all the other leering uncles. Over the next few weeks, the sensational news penetrated our closed world as Auntie Dora filtered each outrage of our persecution. The systemites attempted to brainwash the children to think they had been sexually abused, even though everyone knew that all of our sex was from God and done in love. An auntie described rigorous medical examinations in detail, how children were stripped naked and held down on tables, then poked and prodded with cold metal tools until they cried. Her descriptions did their job of terrifying me, and I decided to never let a man in a white coat touch me. I believed the adults when they told us that doctors were evil. Again and again, Auntie Dora called everyone into the room, and we spent hours, days, weeks going over the explanations. We were not a cult. Cult was an evil, horrible name that systemites used to describe any group they couldn't understand. Cults committed suicide, like in Jonestown. They told their followers that their leader was Jesus and spread false doctrines, like David Koresh did in Waco. We were different. We were the only ones living the true word of God. That meant persecution. The governments of evil countries like America and Argentina demonized religious groups so that they could slaughter them, slaughter children with impunity, like what had just happened in Waco. We were not like Waco. We were like Waco. It was so hard to keep track. Waco embedded itself in my nightmares and scared me enough to stop wishing for the police to raid our communes. Systemites killed children. As much as I loved to fantasize that I had different parents, a family with money and real jobs who sent their kids to normal school, who weren't punished for their spontaneous moments of joy, I spent my days equally terrified of being taken away from my family and the children of God. I couldn't survive in this world, but it was the only world I knew. At age 6, those two truths were already at war inside me. Finally, after almost 2 months had passed, we learned that all of the children and jailed adults had been released and reunited. The systemites dismissed every charge, and the evil judge fell from his high perch, sanctioned by the courts for religious prostitution. The kids had done their jobs and protected the adults. They had convinced the law that we were good, that we were God's children. Here was proof that God would protect us, like Grandpa promised. It was proof, too, that nobody was coming to save me from this life. Not the police, not the big bad system. No one. The story of the raid became larger than life, the center of our make-believe games. Grandpa even had Uncle Zephaniah and some of the other artists make a new comic book, Victory in Babylon, telling a fictionalized version. We loved reading about the excitement of the police raids, imagining the taste of white sugar and soda pop the children had been given. We were awed by the depictions of the court cases where young children, like the fictional Gabriella, valiantly defended the children of God on the witness stand. She became a superhero to us. We read her words over and over until they became our script. I imagined that Abigail, who'd come to live with us now, had been like her, 11 years old, and called on to testify for her faith. There is something comforting about wanting what other people want, to be united in the fervor of shared desire. I hoped and prayed that one day I'd be one of the chosen ones, asked by God to defend against the enemy at the gates. I wanted to be a hero like Gabriella, like Abigail. I took the drills as seriously as every child in the commune. No one wanted to be tried and found wanting when our turns inevitably arrived. But still, there was that nagging desire to escape the fear, hunger, and what I knew must be abuse, even as we were drilled tirelessly to deny it. What I couldn't understand was how no one else saw what I did. In the adults' minds, they told the truth when they denied the abuse. Their lives revolved around the prophet's teachings, and they believed him. If you spare the rod, you spoil the child. In pictures of us, we seem like happy children, dressed in matching outfits, photographed singing and dancing on the streets. The mind can believe whatever it wants, can handpick the evidence, and can throw away the rest. But behind those happy family photos, behind the singing and praying and praising Jesus, there was a little girl who had already started fantasizing about her own death, who, from the age of 4, developed a nail-biting habit so severe that blood constantly dripped from her nail beds and cuticles, who couldn't stop ripping and tearing her skin, despite the adults praying over her, despite the burning hot sauce they poured on her wounds. After the raid, I began making a low guttural humming noise in the back of my throat. Sounds like this. The scratching feeling soothed me. I couldn't stop, even though it constantly got me into more trouble. My ability to control this nervous tic at times, but not at others, was seen as proof of my willfulness and often earned me more beatings, after which it would become even harder to control. When I began to wet my bed again after years without accidents, nobody connected it to the harsh punishments or to the sexual abuse we would never name, that we never talked about. The aunties only spanked me more, telling me it was my rebelliousness, telling me it was my sin. All I knew how to do was believe them. Voice author me was not a fan of author me. Voice actor me was not a fan of author me's decision to make every end of every chapter just like yank your heartstrings. Because they can be hard to record with like no emotion. this is the scarf again I'm making for the child. I really want to put extra yellow stuff here so it like pulls these out. But apparently she wants them to be wrinkled, and I am not allowed to do that. She's usually the design mind in this house, so, we have to go with that. The algorithm brought me back. The algorithm is always punishing me. Yeah, the noise thing. And I've noticed it was only at night too. So it was like a self-soothing thing. And by the way, I've started doing it again and it puts me to sleep so fast. I also I worked for a army colonel who did it, but all the time. We would be talking in a meeting and briefing him about the helicopters. And it was just very like jarring. And I remember asking someone about it because I had done something similar and I'd never seen anything like that. And the doctor said, "Oh yeah, it's a form of Tourette's, or it's in the same family as Tourette's essentially, but this vocal nervous tic that you can't control." It also took me many, many, many years to realize that nail biting and cuticle biting is a form of self-harm. There's actually a name for it. It's something self-focused nervous behaviors, like hair pulling and fingernail biting. But I was always, always, always just treated as this is a bad habit, something you need to stop. And it wasn't until so at the end of Unculture, you see like my career is blowing up and I tell this story of like my life and where I came from and what the children of God was. And I write it down for the first time. And the lieutenant that worked for me after he read it was like, "Now I understand why you bite your nails and fingers until they bleed." And then I also started noticing it as a trend. Actually, in the book Unfollow by Megan Roper Phelps from the Westboro Baptist Church, she talks about how one of the things that made her notice was her sister's nail biting and bleeding cuticles all the time. And I was like, oh. And finally, the most amazing thing is I finally got on a new anxiety prescription that's working very well for me. And suddenly, I'm not biting my nails and I'm not even picking my cuticles that much, which is fascinating. What happens when you deal with the actual problem, the anxiety, and not just the front-facing behavior that people don't like to look at. I also got a lot better at not biting my nails during COVID because it was really awkward to like pull down your mask to bite your fingernail. The name of that book is Uncultured, which is the book that I wrote. You can get it anywhere you buy books. It's a Major Macmillan book. You can get it on audio, which I recorded myself, and it's available in libraries on audio as well. Okay. Today for Devotions with Daniella, we are reading from The Claimant by Rachel Winehouse. This is a beautiful lyrical essay book about dealing with, so she finds out she is the recipient of a class action lawsuit against a gynecologist at USC who was abusing all of these women. When she finds this out, it also activates from her some trauma that she had from being abused in the woods, assaulted in the woods as a 5-year-old. Francine finally gets me to tap about the little girl. It is one simple sentence. Imagine if it was your little boy in the woods. Would you think it was no big deal? I wonder if it is hard for her to say, because it is hard for me to hear. It is 1,000 decibels loud, glass shattering loud, ear piercing, organ splitting loud. If I have already been cracked, this splits me wide open. Even without tapping, hearing her say this, putting my child into the woods, my mind races, my heart thumps. I imagine, with lightning bolt speed, the way I would thunder into the woods, frantic to find my child, to stop it from happening, to save him the way no one saved me. If I am too late, I pray I will never be too late. Every parent wishes they will never be too late. But if the world is that cruel, and it can be, I would talk to my child. I would get him to therapy. I would hold him each night until his nightmares subsided. I would call the police. And if the police didn't come, I'd take a baseball bat to Jason's head. I'd rip up our house from the very roots of the earth. I'd lift it into the sky, dirt falling from the foundations like a dust storm. I'd land our home back on safe ground, far, far away, so he'd never have to spend years, days, minutes, slow-moving seconds walking past the monster at the end of the driveway. I say these things out loud to Francine, and later that day, I gaze at my youngest child, who is 5. Now he's 5.5, and he will make sure you know the half matters. And I still can't believe how little he is. His small hands, his trusting eyes, his open heart, his infectious laughter. I want to throw up, vomit away my memory, because memory makes me realize that no one did those things for me. And I was only 5. 5. I had small hands, trusting eyes, an open heart, and infectious laughter, too. There was no one there to help the little girl, but I'm here now, and I can help her. Francine explains this to me. We can give her now what she may have needed. For the first time, I tap about the little girl. I revisit the woods. I rewrite history. I'm there for her when Jason sets her back down on the other side of the woods, removes his fingers from her insides, and I am there to catch her and hold her and tell her she will be okay. I tell Francine it feels crazy, talking to the little girl like she is real. But she is real, Francine says back. Then she repeats it. She is real. And when she becomes real to me, I understand what Francine means. I visit myself in other memories too, the other moments that stem from the woods. I go back to help and begin to heal the wounds. That part is so beautiful because earlier in the book, she says, I can't deal with it now, but I'll come back for this little girl later. And I had a really good therapist at one of my sessions at the VA, which is unfortunately not that usual. And she had done her residency in women and children from cults. And one of the things that she did is spent a lot of time talking to me about, little Daniella and going back for her. And eventually I did this painting. I'm going to try to find and show you. Where's my painting? Oh, here it is. That's my little girl. It's all glittery in real life. Didn't have very many simple moments like that as a child. Yeah, Jehovah's Witnesses, yikes. Today for Devotions with Daniella, we are reading from Touched Out, Motherhood, Misogyny, Consent, and Control by Amanda Monte. This is a chapter called Body. The beliefs we hold about children and families come from philosophies we hold about parenting as a social institution. For instance, that raising children is a private, not public matter. Parenting under the resulting conditions, in turn, becomes its own process of forceful remaking, an ideological and physical assault on the body and the mind of the parent that for women further molds us into the image of something called mother, who appears nearly indistinguishable from that thing we call woman. There are elements of this transformation that are, or can be, meaningful and liberatory. The way our bodies and brains bend to care is a gorgeous thing, maybe even more so when men get involved, as in how I witnessed my own husband move from clumsy idiot, inelegantly gripping our floppy infant, and what can I doing, to confident, adroit baby wearer, and later a man fluent in the language of parental love. That transformation can also be, as it eventually became for me years later, an opening for women to re-examine their relationship with their bodies, as what's hidden there cracks open, bubbles to the surface, releases and urges us toward new questions and understandings. But there are other elements of the conversion to that thing called mother: the feeling of being trapped, the professional immobility, the social alienation, the emotional repression, the many physical strains that are entirely culturally and politically motivated. It's no wonder our bodies resist. Eventually, I picked up some language online and at the daycare for affirming my own autonomy, trying to scribble an outline around myself to regain some sense of control. I learned to recognize that sacrificing my emotional and physical needs was good for neither me nor my child, though implementing that belief remains a struggle, having been told since girlhood that my desires do not matter. When I was trying to find my footing as a new parent in a sea of recommendations, American parenthood also became inseparable from a wider culture of burnout. There was no amount of boundary setting parents could do verbally with their children or partners to create space for themselves in our increasingly siloed, isolated home lives, especially while still living under the cultural expectation that boundary setting, big or small, made us a little worse at raising our kids. Anne Helen Peterson writes of the general vibe of millennial parenting in the late 2010s in a chapter devoted to the subject in her book about burnout. Can't even. The best parents are the ones who give of until there's nothing left of themselves. Mothers especially felt the pressure to be everything to everyone at all times, save herself. I need to highlight that. That's going in my chapter on self-sacrifice. Not wanting to be touched evokes a particular kind of burnout, one that is visceral, perplexing, often automatic. It comes in waves, when children melt down, hitting and screaming, or when they demand to be held. It's the kind of feeling that leads parents to hide from their children, and it hits hard at the end of a long, manic day caring for children. In the insular settings in which we raise kids in America. As Dr. Pooja Lakshman, a board-certified psychiatrist and New York Times contributor specializing in women's mental health, wrote in response to the parenting crisis of the pandemic, society has turned its back on mothers, and what women feel when they find parenting full of impossible choices is better characterized as betrayal than burnout. While burnout places the blame and thus the responsibility on the individual and tells working moms they aren't resilient enough, Lakshman wrote, betrayal points directly to the broken structures around them. Feeling touched out is one way women's bodies sound the alarm bells on those broken structures that have betrayed them, and on a misogynistic culture that has told them how to comport their bodies, moderate their tone, and carry themselves in public and private spaces all their lives. It is also a feeling that indicates the body has reached its limit and doesn't quite know how to cope. Understandably, because in such a culture, women are discouraged from articulating any feelings about what's not working for us. The pressure we place on mothers to perform constantly at the expense of their own physical and emotional health is to some degree a generational demand. But holding women responsible for everything that goes wrong in a child's life, or that might go wrong, is an American pastime, one that creates a lot of anxiety for mothers, keeping them busy worrying about what they have done wrong, rather than organizing against the betrayals. Mothers have been blamed for everything from serial killings to combat PTSD. By the end of World War II, Freudian fears surrounding incest had spread to popular culture. Films began to depict women with a perverse closeness to their children, especially frightening when the mothers focused too much attention on their sons. These mothers apparently posed a danger to the purity of motherly love. In the early 1960s, the character Norman Bates became one famous victim of his mother's excessive devotion. And in the cultural zeitgeist, psychopathy in men remains frequently linked to the absolute control of a too close mother-son love. Like our cultural narratives for women in pain, national discussions of the intense connections women sometimes experience loving their children, and our views of what counts as normal versus pathological have often reflected political and social anxieties. Yeah, like the American opinion that breastfeeding past 1 year old is somehow creepy, when literally every other advanced nation in the world and the World Health Organization recommends 2 years as a minimum. In his best-selling 1964 book, Generation of Vipers, Philip Wiley blamed megaloid mom worship, gotten completely out of hand, for numerous forms of American national suffering, including both McCarthyism and the widespread PTSD experienced by those sent into combat. Wiley's theory of momism relied on homophobic logic, characterizing overattached sons as psychologically compromised, a popular take at mid-century. His writing was also, confusingly, anti-free enterprise, anti-communist, and pro-Freud, whom he felt Americans misinterpreted because they foolishly thought that since they didn't have sex with their mothers, they weren't implicated by their obvious incestuous obsession with their mothers. Wiley's distaste for maternal desire, however, outlasted the book's momentary popularity. Helicopter Moms, Theories of Overprotection, The Meddler, Mama's Boys, Matthew McConaughey's pathetic character Trip in the 2006 film Failure to Launch, all are reverberations of momism. In these narratives, intense connection between mother and child are understood to be a direct threat to the child's ability to flourish in a country that values rugged individualism and independence. These examples are not hyperbolic, nor even worst-case scenarios. They are part of the fabric of American psychology. In his 1967 book, The Empty Fortress, Infantile Autism and the Birth of Self, Bruno Bettelheim argued that autism is caused by mothers who withdraw from, rather than coddle, their children. Bettelheim's refrigerator mother is so cold and disaffected that her child psychically runs away into a prison of his own minds. Not that the mother is probably also autistic. At the time, autism was categorized as a mental illness, as well as incorrectly conflated with schizophrenia. And although autism spectrum disorder is now widely understood to be caused by brain chemistry, the tendency to lazily imply psychogenic causes for the vast diversity of human experience remains entrenched in popular psychology, implying not only that there is a hierarchy in brain functions, but also that mothers are to blame for human variation, as if the latter were true and as if difference were a bad thing. The field of child development and child psychology has in large part been an institutionalization of mother blame that considers only the white, productive, able-bodied, cis, hetero, male mind, always divorced from the body, to be free of pathology. This framework, nevertheless, continues to filter into public consciousness and shapes the parenting advice industry, which targets underwater parents, especially women, with philosophies that promise to help them not fuck up their children, or finger wags at them when they say or do the wrong things. Is it any wonder mothers find themselves hiding out in bathrooms with their hands over their ears? In the late 2010s, as Hannah was moving into toddlerdom, my own little somatic rebellions would converge with #MeToo, urging me to reconsider what assumptions I was passing down to my daughter by sacrificing my body on the altar of American parenthood. But until then, I coped the only way I knew how, by numbing out, a method I perhaps inherited from my mother, or perhaps from America's hyper-consumerist culture of excess, which tells us that we can indulge our way out of a fundamentally unequal world. Soon, I was drinking every night to quell the relentless anxiety and the voices that said I was doing everything all wrong. American motherhood has always reeked of misogyny, of the expectation that women give and never receive, and of the belief that whatever women do give, it will never be enough, or it will be too much. But what new parent can see anything straight? I had spent my whole life making my body do things it didn't want to do, and so I continued doing what I knew best. Every evening while John worked late at the tutoring center, it was more of the same. Tugging and pulling, demands and tantrums, flying food, unconscionable mess. I cooked dinner between screams and upsets, tried to pull together one fruit, one veggie, one carb, one protein, all on a colorful IKEA plate. I often fell short of completing the pattern, and of course, in other ways. I slammed cupboards and raised my voice. Hannah burst into tears. I atoned, holding her, nursing her, apologizing. "Mommy's just very tired," I said. And after we ate dinner, I fell to my knees, scooping food with my hands from the floor onto the mat I kept under her high chair. I let her cry as I mumbled about what I could and could not give her, what she could expect from me, who I was, as if I knew. Eventually, she moved on, tearing apart the living room while I pulled the corners of the food waste mat together, took the pouch to the trash, and dumped most of what I had cooked into the waste bin, calculating the cost of all the uneaten food. Before bed, I bathed with Hannah, her wet, naked body nursing mine in the tub. This was touch we both welcomed and wanted. I stroked her wet hair out of her face, her eyes looking into mine, as I listened to the clicking of her breath as she gulped and swallowed. We fell together into silence. Some days I repented more for my poor behavior. She melted me. I ached for her. And there was something heartbreakingly consensual in those moments, in how clearly we both said yes, a mutual consent that cleared away all the other muck that often stood between us. After I packaged her up for sleep, I stood in the hallway outside her room, waiting for silence. All the lights in the apartment turned off. I propped my glass of $2 wine, now a nightly feature, on a shelf in the hall closet, and ran through all the ways I had wronged her. When I could finally close the door without waking her up, I drank more, falling asleep on the couch to the glow of reality TV, sobbing women flickering on my face as I passed out in the wreckage of our day. A shit show of broken toys, dirty snack cups, kids' water bottles, puzzle pieces, crushed crackers, costume changes, ripped books, miscellaneous trash. Hours later, I would awake on the couch to my own thirst, walking into the kitchen for water, eyes half closed, forgetting for a moment how the outside world moved inside our apartment at night. In my stupor, I would step right into a trail of sick, wet slugs, which crawled in through the open seals of the apartment at dark, dotting the kitchen floor as they hunted for the scraps of food I had neglected to clean up after dinner. Oh, that must be so creepy. Say hi? No, you just want to growl? Look. Everybody wants to say hi. Say hi. Hi, Z's. I'm the grumpiest dog you ever met. Thanks. I'm so glad you like my life. One more thing to talk about. So about 2 days ago, I got a Facebook message from somebody who had read my book. And Uncultured has been criticized quite a few times for its actual depictions of sexual assault. There are reviews that are like, this is just a book about rape. And not for nothing, I did have to come in and warn the sound engineer about how many horrible assaults we were going to have in that day's recording. Finally, in chapter 23, I got to be like, okay, Brian, all the raping is done. However, I put them down in books because I think sometimes you have to show just exactly how bad things get in places like sex cults and the US Army. And also because other people's depictions of their assaults have helped me understand what happened to me or find the language and context for what happened to me. So about 2 days ago, this woman gets in contact with me and she was like, oh my God, what happened to you in chapter 14, which is my chapter, Not Fit for the Kingdom of God, which is where this Uncle Jose, rapes me. It's when I decide I want to leave the cult. And she was like, it was exactly the same thing. It was exactly the same thing, except instead of using a computer to lure me into the room, he used a television. And this was after she had just given birth to his grandson because she got knocked up by his son. They then treated her horribly, and at one point they kidnapped her son and kept him away from her for 6 years, which I just cannot even imagine. But, she told me, she was like, I just kept reading chapter 14 over and over and over again, and it was like living in my own deja vu. And this, of course, is a very interesting contrast from another girl who lived around the same communes in Mexico, whose first reaction was, Daniella stole my rape story, instead of, oh, maybe the rapist who ultimately got in trouble for abusing dozens of girls and who ran communes specifically full of teenage girls for 25 years. Maybe he just did the same thing twice with the remarkably similar pattern. Because as we know, that happens. Anyway, it was good, I guess, to hear from her, to have this conversation. I sent her a signed book and I wrote this part from the epilogue that says, what does it say? Oh, am I going to find it? Come on, I'm going to find it. Yeah. Sharing my story with others like me has helped me to find a sisterhood. And even a sisterhood born from the worst kind of shared trauma is better than going through life alone. And I had this crazy moment after the book came out where I just panicked and I was like, if you read it as a voyeuristic mindset, I really did kind of write some pretty bad trauma corn. But since I've written it, so many people have reached out to me. And I never, ever knew or even imagined how common childhood sexual abuse was, especially from people in your own family or who were supposed to be close to you. And I think all of those people feel seen when they read the story that I wrote, which is, of course, the main thing I wanted to do was help give context and language to other people to help them describe and understand their own experiences, because that is something that has helped me to heal so much. Anyway, you never know. You never know who's going to read your story and connect to it. the military is toxic, especially for women. And she says it's a high control group, isn't it toxic for everyone? I think yes, but I would also say especially for women. And I think one of the reasons that I wrote Uncultured was to show the good men, like my 6'2", blonde, blue-eyed helicopter pilot husband, that being in the exact same system was very, very different for me than it was for him. And that operating in any system that was not made for you is damaging. So even, the rape culture and everything aside, it's like, we look at women and we say they're bad soldiers, they shoot worse. And we never look at the rifle and say, this rifle was made for a 6-foot man. So are all of our kitchens, by the way. And maybe we should do something about that. Maybe we should have weapons, equipment, armor, and uniforms for half of the world's population. But no, we are the only developed nation that does not have fatigues for women. Because every effing time we try to bring it up, we get told, well, you got to look sexy in uniform. Not just we have different freaking bodies. We understand it in dress uniform, right? So this is another thing that's just harder on women. So when men put their dress uniforms together, it goes off of their pockets. Every single male uniform is the same, which also means you can drop off your uniform and all of your bling at the local dry cleaners and have some long-suffering Asian women put it together for you. For women, the way we stack everything on our chests goes off of our chests. And of course, we don't have pockets. Women. What do they need those for? So first of all, this means that we know that women's bodies are different than men, and we have to do different things for our bodies. It also means that not only can women not pay someone to put it together for them, we can't even get help from our non-commissioned officers, who are usually not also women. It's usually very rare to find more than a couple women that you directly work with. So yeah, tiny example. And of course, in Uncultured, I wrote about the vest that wasn't created to keep women alive. The bulletproof vest. Yeah. Fun times. Okay, friends, that is a wrap for my devotions today. 10 more minutes, but it's never a bad time to get started.